Today we're going to be talking about step 6 of translation, basic scripture checks in Paratext. In the first 3 steps of translation, the team has worked themselves on the translation. In steps 4 and 5, they have tested the translation with other speakers of their language. Now in steps 6 through 8, they're going to get the text ready for a consultant check. And the first thing that needs to be done is basic scripture checks. Cleaning up your text. In the consultant check, the consultant will be looking at many different things. If the translation is accurate, clear, and natural. But he'll also be looking at punctuation and formatting. And Paratext can help clean up these last 2 items so that the punctuation and formatting is correct. By cleaning up problems in punctuation and formatting, the consultant can concentrate on more important issues. For instance, he won't need to say, there's a problem here with your punctuation. You have a space before a question mark, and that space shouldn't be there. And there's no space after the question mark, and a space should be there. So basic scripture checks can help find those kinds of problems so that the consultant doesn't have to spend time doing it. Now, it's best to take care of punctuation and formatting problems as you go, as you are making the translation, rather than trying to catch them all at the end with basic scripture checks. So as much as possible, type and format correctly so that you have as few errors as possible to clean up at the end. So when is the best time to run basic scripture checks? Well, basic scripture checks should be run just before making the back translation. This will ensure that the punctuation and formatting are correct, both in your text and in your back translation, since the back translation should have the same punctuation and formatting as your text. So by doing this right before you make the back translation, that ensures that those punctuation and formatting will be correct for the consultant when he looks at your text. How do you run basic scripture checks? Put the cursor in your project and hit Checking, Run Basic Checks. This opens a new window with checks you can run. It's best to run just one check at a time, especially early in a project. So if you were to mark all of the boxes, you would get back very many problems that need to be taken care of. But it's easier if you just check one box and take care of all the same kinds of problems at once before moving to the next box. Before running basic scripture checks, it will help tremendously to tell Paratext in advance what punctuation is correct or valid and what punctuation is incorrect or invalid. Paratext then remembers that, and in the future as you are typing, if you have punctuation that is different than what has been marked as correct or valid, it will signal that there is a problem. So signaling whether punctuation is correct or not is done through inventories. So if you hit checking, there is a characters inventory, there is a punctuation inventory, and there is a quotation rules. We'll go over each of those on the next slides. I'm going to share with you a way to more quickly do the inventories, telling Paratext what is correct and what is incorrect. You could just do this naturally as you type in text and go through each of the punctuations that are in your text to decide if it is correct or incorrect. But the following 10 slides will show you how to quickly tell Paratext what's valid, what's invalid. Now this might have already been done for you in advance when your computer was set up, but we'll still review here how it was done. So in order to quickly tell Paratext what is correct and incorrect, text can be pasted into a verse in Paratext, even if it's not text in your language. For example, this punctuation is correct, text, comma, space, text. Another line would have this punctuation is not correct, text, comma, text with no space. The following line, text, space, comma, and then text without a space, that also is not correct. And the last one also is not correct with 2 spaces on either sides of the comma. So this kind of text can be pasted into a verse, not just for commas, but for full stops, question marks, exclamation points, semicolons, and various other punctuation. That will then quickly tell Paratext what is correct and incorrect as you go through and mark valid for the punctuation that is correct and invalid for the ones that are not correct. Later you can delete that text from that verse, but Paratext still remembers what was correct and what was not correct. So that's a much more quick and comprehensive way of quickly telling Paratext what is right and what is not right. And a sample with all the options like this for different punctuation is available. We can give that to you on a handout in case this has not already been done on your computer before you received it. So let's talk about the punctuation inventory. The inventories only need to be done on one computer, the admin computer in Paratext. And then when doing a send receive, it copies that information to other computers in the project. So let's see how we might go about doing this punctuation inventory quickly using a text like what I just showed you. So to set up the punctuation inventory, you can paste the text with all the punctuation options from the handout we gave you into, for instance, Revelation 22 verse 1. It can be any verse. Now you would hit Checking, Punctuation Inventory, and a new window like this will open. You now hit Choose Books and then select Revelation in the new window that opens, since that is where we pasted in the text for doing the punctuation inventory. You can go down through the list using your arrow key, highlighting items one by one. If it says the punctuation is not correct, you hit Invalid. This will make a red X mark next to that punctuation. Now for marking as valid, if it says the punctuation is correct, then you would hit Valid. This makes a green check mark next to that punctuation item. So the marking of valid or invalid for this pasted text can be done in advance on the admin computer by an IT person to speed up the process. They don't even need to know your language. They just need to know the correct rules of punctuation for your language. Now, in addition to the punctuation inventory, there's also a character inventory. So also pasted into Revelation 22:1, from the handout I gave containing different punctuation options, was a list of characters used in the projects in Asia where I work. Now you can replace those with characters from the languages in the country where you work. And these can be found in Project, Language Settings, Alphabetic Characters. You then hit Checking and Characters Inventory. Now we need to mark as valid or invalid the various characters. So go down through the list using your arrow key. You should be able to mark most as valid, and the green check mark will appear. So this is a quick way of seeing all the various characters that would be used in your translation and marking them as correct or incorrect in advance of running the check. Now to delete the trial text. Once punctuation and characters have been marked as valid or invalid, the text can be deleted from Revelation 22:1. Paratext will remember what is correct or incorrect as then you type in your own translation in Luke or elsewhere. As you work on your translation, you may occasionally have other things that you need to mark as valid or invalid in your inventories. But by doing this exercise, you will have already finished marking the great majority of them in advance, and that's very helpful. Another type of rule or inventory has to do with quote marks. In Paratext, you first need to set the quotation rules. So once again, in your project, you would hit checking quotation rules. And then you can run the quotations check when you run basic scriptures check by ticking the box next to quotations. So once again, you would hit checking quotation rules and then set the opening, continuing, and closing quote marks as in the window below. Some examples on the following slides will show you then what this will do for quote marks. So in the quotation rules, we specified that what is valid is to open a speech quotation with an opening double quote mark, and we should close a speech quotation with a closing double quote mark. For example, Jesus said, opening double quote, go and do the same, period, closing double quote. Now, a quote inside another quote has single quotation marks. For example, the man replied, opening double quote, the scriptures say, opening single quote, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, closing single quote. They also say, opening single quote, love your neighbors as much as you love yourself, closing single quote, and closing double quote. So these are correct usages of double and single quote marks for quoted speech and a quote inside another quote. Now, if there is a third level of quotes, it goes back from single quotes to double quotes. In Luke, this only occurs in one time in chapter 12, chapter 15, and chapter 20. Now, if a speech quotation continues over several paragraphs, you start each new paragraph with a new opening double quote or continuing quote. That is how teams in Nepal are doing this across multiple paragraphs with continuing quotes. For other languages in other countries, they may have decided to do it without the continuing quote. Once you have finished setting the punctuation inventory, the character inventory, and the quotation rules, now you can run basic scripture checks. So hit checking, run basic checks, and then go through each one at a time to run the check for each of the items listed there. When you click on one of the categories to run a check, a new window opens with a list of problems, like the window below at left. You can then double-click on each problem and solve it in the window that opens at the right. Once you're all done, you can rerun the check and there should be no problems left. Now, if there are many items in the list of problems, for instance, hundreds or thousands, and some of those are not errors, well, then you need to go back to the inventory step again and mark the ones that are correct as being valid, and then the ones that are incorrect as invalid. Then when you run the check again, there won't be so many problems listed that need to be taken care of. So some final words about basic scripture checks. It can take a while at first to get the inventories correct and the checks to run correctly. But for later checks, it should go faster and become easier. Running basic checks will ensure your consultant will be able to concentrate on items that are important, and it will help make your text ready to publish. So if the inventories used in basic scripture checks have already been marked as valid or invalid on your computer, for instance by an IT person working ahead of time, I want to give you an exercise that you can do so that you can have some practice running basic scripture checks. Of course, usually you can only do basic scripture checks after you have entered text into your translation. And if you are still new at your translation, you might not have text yet in order to check. So I'd like you to type the text on the next slide into Revelation 22 verse 1. And yes, we have introduced some mistakes into this text so that when you run basic scripture checks, it will find them. Then you should mark items as valid or invalid in the following inventories: the checking punctuation inventory, and then hit checking characters inventory. Ask your consultant for help if you run into difficulty doing this. Okay, here is the text you will be typing. This is Acts 1:6 with some mistakes introduced. So type that into Revelation 22:1 and then run the punctuation inventory and the character inventory to mark as valid or invalid any items that appear as problems. Once you have finished running basic scripture checks before a consultant check, you can then proceed to step 7, making the back translation. Having cleaned up the formatting and punctuation in your text, when you then make the back translation for the consultant, it will then also have the formatting and punctuation correct in the back translation as well. And then your consultant won't have to ask you about all those small things, but will be able to concentrate on the meaning of the text and what there might need to be changed. So that is the end of today's teaching on basic scripture checks. If you do need help, you can ask another translator from another related language who already knows how to use basic scripture checks, or you can get help from an IT person. You can search for help in Paratext or watch training videos on how to use basic scripture checks. Paratext is constantly changing, so some of these steps in later versions might be slightly different, but in the basic way that they are working will be similar. So I hope that will help, and that it will help you as you clean up your text and get it ready for both the consultant and publication. So God bless you. See you next time. If you're taking this training as part of a translation workshop, you'll see in the green box on the workshop schedule that we've just finished going over step 6 of translation, basic scripture checks. In our next class, the box in red, We won't be doing a translation exercise in language teams like we usually do in session 4, but we'll be going over a translation principle, translating unknown ideas. And that's the first of 3 presentations on translating unknown ideas.